Welcome to On Defense and Security, a podcast that examines domestic and international defense and military affairs. Through conversations, we will bridge the gap between academic research and policy and provide a platform for informed discussions, enabling our listeners to better understand critical issues.
So I'm joined today by Kacper Rekawek, as an academic and security expert specializing in terrorism, violent extremism, and foreign fighters. He currently serves as the Senior Research Fellow and Program Lead for Current and Emerging Threats at the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism in The Hague. He's the author of 3 books, the most recent of which is the first systematic study of the phenomenon of foreign fighting in the Russo-Ukrainian War, published in December 2022 by Routledge, called Foreign Fighters in Ukraine, the Brown-Red Cocktail. And if you want to read a more up-to-date report, just published a month ago on the ICCT website, called People Are Still Fighting, Lack of Change for the Foreign Fighters for Ukraine. So welcome, Kacper.
Thank you for
Uh,
having me.
Maybe we can start with a little bit of history, just for anyone in the audience who might not know kind of the background to this conflict. I'm curious where you would start if you had to kind of tell the story of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Like where would you start that story?
Well, I mean, Vladimir Putin says 10th century, right? And so there is this old Polish joke, because I'm Polish, that the Poles met the Russians for the first time in the 10th century, and our relations haven't improved since then. So, we could go there, but I understand that this might not be the most helpful perspective. I think the bottom line is 2013-14, when essentially, if we were to simplify it, Ukraine stands at the crossroads and is about to sign essentially an association agreement with the European Union. That's not full-scale membership, that's miles away from it. But it's a significant move, and quite a few people in the European Union invest a lot of time to bring Ukraine to that position. And it seems like an obvious choice. There is a buildup of support for that within Ukraine, but there's also a buildup of rejection of that, let's put it this way. And I think at this point, Russia decides to use this excuse, so to speak, of this conflict in a country which is, it's thoroughly divided, far from homogeneous. I mean, Ukrainians are also saying this. And a country which has seen, let's say, decades of very peculiar political polarization. I mean, we've all seen it, but Ukrainian is very regional and linguistic, so to speak, that, you have these maps and everyone follows this model that, the West and the center of Ukraine vote for Europe and the East and the South vote for, inverted commas, Russia. And there's apparently a language split. Not really, because quite a few of the pro-European Ukrainians actually speak Russian at home, and that's the funny side of it. The Ukrainian far right speaks Russian, and no one minds. It's the whole. It's a pretty complex thing, but at this same time, Russia decides to basically go for these cleavages and use them as a part of its geopolitical game, because as once my compatriot Zbigniew Brzezinski famously said, Russia is not an empire without Ukraine. And they see it as a chance. This is the focal point. This is the make or break in a way, a fork in the road. You cannot be pro-Russian and be an associated member of, let's say, an associate of the European Union. And this is the time for the Russians to make their break, so to speak. I think the first one is truly state-inspired, state-controlled, the move for Crimea in early 2014, which is then followed by this beautiful Russian thing of an initially non-state, but then embraced by the state operation conducted by elements within the Russian oligarchy. I'm sure there's plenty of discussions about Ukrainian oligarchs. Very few discuss Russian oligarchs, but it is a Russian oligarch that launches that, Konstantin Malofeyev, in 2014, an attack on the Donbass. And we go from this is basically the beginning, the beginning of the hostilities, because Ukraine there is not a single bullet fired in Crimea, but there are many bullets fired in Donbass, actually by the Russians first, by people coming in from the outside. And then you go into this conflict, which people say is frozen or cold or whatever, but it is going on till 2022, that effectively there is a contact line in the middle of the region, in the middle of Donbass, where both sides kind of delineate. Yet at the same time, the fire is exchanged. Ukraine never accepts the loss of territory, builds up its armed forces to the best of its possibility, and so does Russia, by the way. So it's never resolved. But I mean, there is this hope that it will stay with us, a bit like that, I guess, forever, or for a, for a very, 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 very long time, because, there are attempts to solve this crisis, the Minsk agreements, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, which don't get anywhere really. And then throughout 2021, you have this mysterious buildup of Russian forces along Ukrainian borders, not once, but twice, actually, once in the spring and then in the autumn. And then you have these essays written by Vladimir Putin, 5,000 word essays saying, going back to the 10th century, right, when the Kievan Rus was essentially one big country and we were one all big happy family, that kind of, really skating on thin ice here. I'm speaking to the Canadians, so conscious of that. And then everything changes 24th of February 2022 when Russia launches effectively a full-scale invasion, hoping that this would be the end of it. But I think directly, this is something that starts in late 2013. But then, we could stretch it back hundreds and hundreds of years. But maybe that's not for this podcast, or maybe for some other question.
I'm curious at in parallel, how has the Ukrainian national identity kind of evolved in this tit for tat since 2013? Like, do you see it as fairly consistent, or has that view of themselves also evolved over time?
I think, Amar, it's more of an issue how they express that very identity, and the fact that some of them are leaving the Russian language, or quite a few, and are including the president, who is from a Russian-speaking region of Ukraine. Kryvyi Rog is, well, I mean, it's in the south, central, east, or whatever you want to call it. And he now has to speak Ukrainian, and you can hear it's a learned language, right? It goes without saying, but credit to him. I think definitely writers and writers, journalists, poets, or intellectuals who have been stressing the fact that our identity is different. And our identity has not flourished throughout the time of the Soviet Union, because this is another Russian fallacy. That you were happily with us and you could all do your thing. Absolutely, that was not the case. I think in this sense, this is being rediscovered, not in a nationalist way, but I think as a kind of like, we're different and we're just more conscious of it. But I think, to be honest with you, as I always known and remembered Ukrainians, they were always conscious of the fact that they're different from the Russians. That did not mean that they wouldn't watch Russian TV or Russian news, or, have the same must be the music type of shows between Russia and Ukraine. And that, I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky actually toured Russia with his cabaret / whatever it really was. And because they were Russian speaking, they could be on Russian national TV. So that was a kind of like, let's say, cultural overlaps. I don't want to say union, far from it. But I think now, these bridges are being burned, they've burned. And from this point of view, Ukrainians are kind of like, more hardcore in a sense that, look, it's a thing of the past. So I think it's more of an issue of an expression, not so much rediscovery of the fact that they're different, but maybe giving a bit more floor to the voices that have been saying that for years and wouldn't be heard in Kiev for years, for the very simple reason, Amar, that, for example, they would be expressing themselves in Ukrainian. And as I said, Kiev was a Russian-speaking city. It still is. And if you wanted to be a public intellectual and speak Ukrainian in Kiev, well, tough luck. I would say that's a way easier situation now, but at the same time, it's a city under bombs. So I'm not sure we're talking normal times, but I think the recognition that we've been different, we are different, that there are certain markers, also historical and cultural, that differentiate us from the Russians is just because, it's become more obvious in this sense, even amongst the people who have never been rabid nationalists.
How do you think this conflict would have been different, if you can do like a counterfactual kind of history if there was no Trump one? Because you had kind of the conflict start in 2013, 2014, but then Trump shows up in 2015, 16 and kind of changes the dynamic a little bit, right? But if you remove Trump and let's say you put in somebody else, like what do you think we would still be where we are today?
Fascinating question, Amor. I would say, Ukrainians have a lot of beef
Mm.
with the previous democratic administrations of the United States. And if, for example, if you read the memoirs of the world leaders who were leading different countries around 2014. Maybe not so much the American, but like, it stuck with me the David Cameron's memoirs when he was basically saying, look, my pitch, I had this thing going with Putin. And I was basically calling him and saying, okay, what can I do to make you stop?
Yeah.
When after Crimea was taken, and effectively he's saying, you just stop there. You take what you've got, and that's fine. So I think there was this, and Ukrainians recognize this. There was this mentality of like the world looking at them as a bit of a circus slash joke, and then someone punches them or pinches them really, and everyone just shrugs, I guess. Now Trump comes in, and I think there's like there are two sides to this story. Because on one hand, there is this obsession of his with Ukraine as a place where the members of the Biden family were present. Therefore, Ukraine needs to do things for me so I can prosecute them at home. So this is, this is the downside. The upside is that he is the one who actually, goes after the Nord Stream. He is the one on his watch, certain decisions are being made vis-a-vis the equipment for the Ukrainian army. We're still miles away from 2022 and then what eventually the administration of Joe Biden gives Ukraine. But he's the one who keeps it moving in this sense. So it's what would be I'd love to know. I think, I'd say, Amar, the present day reality isn't very pretty, and I dread it could be worse. I'm not sure, I don't believe in this. Had I been as President Trump says, I mean, had I been still, second term, then this would have never happened. No, it would have happened. It would have happened 100%, because I think the key issue is, which eventually kind of, let's say, convinced the Russians to go in, is Afghanistan, funnily enough. The kind of the effect of the Black Hawk Down, so to speak, times 1,000. So the Americans are running from Afghanistan, and it turns into a disaster, and they're weak. And let's just say, throughout the last few years, we've all seen that the Russian intelligence community isn't great in terms of like the content it provides to the leaders. It certainly, panders to the gallery in terms of the content, but it's certainly how actual and factual the content they provide them, the intel they provide them is correct. But an event such as an Afghanistan withdrawal, I'm sure it convinced people in Moscow to say, right, we've got them on the run. Now we can go. Now is the time. Ukraine has this, and then again, Ukraine has this weak president. The guy just danced on our national TV dressed up as a woman. This is ridiculous. Like, how unmanly to the Russian leaders. This is the moment. So we go in, and I think, regardless of who was the American president, I'm saying this fully conscious of the fact that President Trump fully started, the process with the Taliban. And it would have, finished up during his second term had he had the second term right after his first. So that's why I'm trying to say that probably wouldn't be that different, to be honest. I mean, it would be a fascinating thing to see how the US responds to that. Because, credit to Joe Biden, might have been slow at the beginning, or very slow. I'm saying this consciously as a Pole, when the government of my country was essentially pushing him over the edge to say, like, come on, dude, like, go for it. But I would love, maybe I wouldn't love to see President Trump in that situation, but it would be a fascinating thing for sure.
How do you think Putin views these people, like, as on a personality level? Not Zelensky, but I mean like Trump versus Biden versus Harris. Like, how do because there's always these, kind of conspiracy theories about what Putin has on Trump and all these kinds of conversations, right? And so I'm curious how you think Putin views the American leaders as they come and go, and he's just kind of there the whole time.
Yeah, that's a good point, Omar. I think at the end of the day, he would still say that an American is an American. And this is it, like deep down. I don't think he has a compromising material on Trump. Although sometimes it looks as if he
Sometimes it's hard to tell, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to tell exactly, but I don't think that's the case. I think we sometimes, oversell him to the general public because he just worked for this organization, which in the 1980s suffered a catastrophic failure. Let's put it this way. And he was part of that failure. And he spoke about this, this moment in Dresden when there is this, group of people effectively storming the compound when he was working, and he's the one guy who has the guts to step out. So credit to him in this sense. But at the same time, you're not the fact that you're a member of the KGB doesn't make you like, James Bond. Plenty of people work for that institution, and some of them were utter failures. Now, I think the Russian point of view, I mean, certainly, Amar, the world is viewed, I mean, it's probably going to have to change now with the Chinese, but definitely the world, as I always understood it, it's us and the Americans. Or no, it's Americans, and the Americans need to acknowledge that we're there as well. And we will make sure that they acknowledge us. And this is one of the ways to get their attention. And whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, or whether it's somebody else, they don't care. However, from the practical point of view, definitely when you look at the peace moves now, well, it seems that the American administration at times behaves as if, well, it was, I don't know, the midwife of the Russian wishes and the pro-Russian outcome of these very negotiations. From that point of view, they'll be happy, but at the same time, they'll always be suspicious that there is something there that will come right back at them. So I think as much as they might enjoy what's happening now, they will always be fearful that there is this kind of question mark right at the end.
What surprised you most about the second Trump term so far from January to today? I mean, with respect to Ukraine, because there's that famous, there's a famous encounter in the White House with the "Do you even own a suit?" and all these things. What kind of sticks out about how it's playing out this time around?
Yeah, I think for Europeans, Amar, I mean, for me, would be J.D. Vance's speech at Munich. Not so much that he would be of such a mindset, because that's not a surprise. But I think that you fly over with your family and then you go out and you say what you say and how you say it. Yeah, I still think, I probably was still hoping for some version of Trump 1. That somehow.
Can you outline his speech for those like who might not remember? Yeah.
Exactly. So J.D. Vance comes in and basically spends most of his time castigating Europeans for being Europeans. Really, that's what he basically said. Picking fights with individual countries, slagging off UK, Romania very strongly for alleged anti-democratic biases inherent or now inherent in our political systems. So he hardly spends a minute talking about security as such, as security is mostly understood by Europeans, and spends a lot of time about our political system, our deficiencies, our biases, and stuff like that. Of course, from a perspective that we in Europe would call the far right perspective, and it's an attack on everybody else. And quite a few of the people who are listening to him, or hardly 99% or 95%, are actually political, representatives of the political trends that he just attacked. So, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, liberals, etc., etc. The whole broad European family of the kind of, people who get elected, or at least used to get elected.
Yeah.
And now he's clearly saying that, well, there is this family of people who are close to me, the kind of, radical right, let's put them this way, the democratic far right, if I could put it this way, who are not in the room. And you should basically be talking to them, and you should model your policies on their wishes and their projections for Europe. I mean, it's a staggering piece of oratory, an arrogance. I liked some of the opening stuff when he said, basically, you're all now saying that you're spending money on defense. Yet the question is whether you're ready to use it. And I think that's a fair question to Europe. That is a very fair question. That's in some ways has been asked by the different US administrations for the last 2 decades, especially the Republican ones, in all fairness. And now he asks this, and I'm thinking, right, and I'm reading the transcript of the speech, and I'm thinking, right, okay, let's see where he goes from there. No, then it gets to people who cannot pray in Scotland, or, the coup in Romania, and things like that. And that's probably, for me, that was probably the lowest point, because then I remember seeing people who are posting about the fact that they're going to Munich, or they're going to moderate a panel or stuff like that. And I was like, Jesus Christ, this is wrong, because the train has left the station. Our field of, the talking heads, the experts, the people with who wear glasses and who read books and write books sometimes, we're just useless to this situation, right? That was probably my lowest point at the time. Of course, the Oval Office, yeah, I mean, that was staggering, but I think it was to some extent I'm of a view that it was staged for the benefit of the American audience of the
Right.
of the duo that was there. So I kind of could rationalize this, but I somehow had issues with trying to rationalize JD Vance's approach, which was really, yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a slap on the face. Like, I am first to say that Europe needs a few
Mm.
of these, but well, maybe not a punch up, in the
I mean,
nose.
it seemed to arise out of this kind of Steve Bannon civilizational kind of rhetoric that's been always, I guess, simmering in the background of Trump. You just never know whether Trump believes it also, or it's
Yeah.
just the people behind him. Like we used to talk about George Bush and Karl Rove as George Bush's brain and all this stuff, right? And
Yeah,
I think there are quote unquote brains behind Trump who um, think very much along these civilizational terms,
absolutely.
and it becomes quite apparent, right?
Absolutely. But you wouldn't, you just wouldn't probably think of them as speakers at the, Munich Security
Yeah,
Conference, or
yeah.
even if they were there, that they would somehow, first, look, Amar, like first term, I was at GLOBSEC in Slovakia and we hosted Mike Pompeo
Mm.
when he was the Secretary of State. And that's, he's trillions of miles away from J.D. Vance in terms of, outlook and policy. But he was a member
Right.
of an administration that wasn't exactly enamored with or by Europe. And he comes over to Bratislava and he basically gives the transatlantic message. So, you're hoping for things like this, that even if, I don't want to say the adults in the room, the Jim Mattises and, the phrase that someone's going to moderate this. No, but I was still hoping that this will not be so outright towards us, because internally for the US, I had zero hopes, and obviously, the president is only kind of living up to that expectation. But externally, I felt like, okay, I'm going to push you on the money, and I'm going to threaten this or that, but I'll leave you to your own devices. And generally, I would say, like, look, we're in the same boat because you're useful as an ally. But this was essentially, I wasn't a declaration of war, God forbid, no, but it was a declaration of like, are you useful to us?
Yeah.
Are we on the same team? That kind of, which is, well, I mean, for a Central Eastern European such as myself, that's shocking. And I've had quite a few Western European colleagues that turn around and to me and say like, hey, I told you, we told you so. You should have, put your eggs in a different basket. But my question and my tragedy, Amar, would be, what's the other basket?
Right.
That's probably something we can touch upon in this conversation as well.
Well, I mean, let's do that now. Like, what is the other basket?
I mean, look, so now, the funny thing, Amar, is that it seems that there are two plans essentially, as I see it from this side of the Atlantic, or plans or options.
Yeah.
Option one, of which especially the UK is a huge proponent, and Poland kind of, is there as well, when they're saying, look, whatever comes out of the US, kind of treat it seriously, but don't,
Mhm.
and work on the practicalities of keeping them as much as possible on our side in Europe and in the same camp, in the same basket, so to speak, right? If you put it this way. So that's certainly one. And I think you even have the likes of Macron and people like that actually admitting this, that their preferred order of things would be not for the US to just, ship itself to Mars security
Yeah.
wise,
Yeah.
but essentially staying put to some extent, or at least guaranteeing, the what is now dubbed the kind of, peacekeepers, or whatever the force is supposed to be named, this kind of, European force that is supposed to go into Ukraine and maintain, well, the new contact line,
Yeah.
essentially, somewhere. So that's the option one. And I credit all who work on this and who, desperately try to kind of, maintain the bridges that have always been there between Washington and Europe. And that's fine. Although, let's just say it probably brings diminishing returns. And I have strong urge to say, don't waste your time because it's not going to get you anywhere. But I understand that, trying to kind of like to advocate for the severance of all those ties from a European perspective, that would be foolish, to say the least. So that's one. The second basket, so to speak, and the second option is, the famous, Europe steps up, Europe gets its act together. So all these different constellations through which Europe would essentially be slowly building up a force that can project strength outside its core area, without so much reliance on the US and eventually further down the line, totally without the US or minimal US. So the kind of the European option. And, as far as declarations are concerned, Amar, it's beautiful. Everyone declares they will spend more, they're buying more, ordering more, etc., etc. That's great. But, with Europe, there's always been this issue in defense. Do you mean what you say?
Yeah.
And, is this what you are willing to do? And let's just say that again, as a pessimistic Central Eastern European, I'm kind of like pretty doubtful whether all the members of the EU will now chip in, and not only chip in, but then if push comes to shove, actually deploy these forces to where they're needed and accept the political fallout from the fact that, well, there are body bags coming home
Hmm.
because of some conflict in a faraway land. So these are the kind of two options. And I think for me, as someone who's not in the government, I always try to, I don't know, you can rock the boat a bit more, I don't know, or like, suggest
Yeah.
the issues. And I'm saying, is there plan C? Is there option C? And for me, as much as I love my Western allies in Europe, I'm kind of skeptical whether they would actually put the money where their mouths are, to be honest with you. That's not to say they wouldn't, but I'm doubtful. Plus, the whole debate around, the peacekeepers or intervention for stabilization force in Ukraine actually shows you that that's not really serious stuff going on there. So for me, as someone living in Poland, I'm always like, okay, so the plan C maybe shouldn't we try and put things together with our own coalition of the willing, the people who have no choice, so to speak, and that includes Poland, that includes the Baltic states, to some extent it includes Romania, Finland, maybe Sweden, places like maybe Czech Republic, so the kind of, let's say, the eastern flank.
Yeah.
Now, a few years back, one could be saying, well, that's not enough. But nowadays, and Ukraine has amply demonstrated that with the weakened Russia, the badly led Russia, wasteful Russia of Vladimir Putin, couldn't crack Ukraine. And I would have serious doubts if it would crack such a coalition, especially if it was somehow supported by the West. But there's one key element here, Ukraine.
Mm.
That this new coalition actually gets Ukraine to, intervene on its behalf as well, because Ukraine now has this huge army, well-trained, experienced,
Experience.
has
Yeah.
resources, and I think that's the next diplomatic task for the countries of the eastern flank, so to speak, of NATO, to actually get around that problem and that issue, to actually settle on a solution which, and do it in such a way that it does not offend anybody in the West. Because Amar, one thing, a word of warning with us is always that once you start doing things like that, I can see French or German politicians turn around and say, well, oh, you clearly don't need us anymore.
Mm.
So you do you, and we do Nord Stream, gas line
Yeah.
between us and Russia. And you do you. I can clearly see that. So I think that's why we don't see the kind of overt moves towards such plan C, so to speak, is that some people
Especially since you're also seeing kind of these nativist protectionist streak popping up in Western Europe also, right?
exactly,
And so
exactly.
they would love to say, you do
It's
you.
on you.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think, that's a clever game, but I would say, see, I think mentally, countries of my region, Amar, I would say, and that to some extent includes Ukraine, but like the EU NATO members, for 20 years, no, for the first 15 years after 1989, they had a foreign policy which was join EU, join NATO. By 2004, 2007, they all do. And then essentially, my impression is that in many of these places, it's kind of like, now it's holiday time. Because we got where we wanted to, and we're kind of navigating the waters of foreign policy as members of these two organizations. And effectively, what option C would entail is a bit of go on your own. Now, can you mentally do it after, decades of being conditioned to first become and then be, and then, actually function as a member of the West? Well, that's a tricky proposition. So that's why I'm still struggling with this one. I'd love to see it a bit more stressed. I don't think my colleagues in Estonia would be so much against it because they constantly, kind of, bombard me with questions like, what will you do? And I go like, oh, the EU, and they go, no, 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 no. They go like, what will your country do? And I think it's a fair question. And I mean, the same
Yeah.
question could be put to Canada, like, especially given the fallout between US and Canada, what will you guys do? Are you willing to put your chips in there? Which are there, by the way, and not to deny that Canadian troops are already there. So there's plenty of combinations and permutations there. There's also some political obstacles. But hey, now is the time to actually work it all out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's happening out of necessity to some extent, also because people are realizing that this kind of taken for granted presence of the U.S. Is no longer taken for granted, right? Look how quickly we're only in April.
Exactly. Yeah.
Look how quickly the post-World War II kind of te
Crumbled, right?
teams and institutions and norms
Yeah.
just were thrown out the window, and so. If we can no longer just kind of depend or take for granted the presence of the U.S. as this stabilizing force or someone who's going to intervene, um, and that's not to say with Trump gone, whatever next administration is going to reverse everything, right? And so
Yeah.
this is the
Probably
new
not.
this is the new
Yeah.
norm now, and or it's at least there's at least aspects of the new norm built into what Trump is doing. And that means everyone else is going to have to, form new alliances and figure things out.
Exactly. I thought couldn't agree more, Amara. And I think especially on the point that there is a new administration and all will be back.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think it's for any country. People can ask about A, B, C, or D if there is a change, and if it's so ingrained, I think definitely half of the American electorate, and I mean good chunk of the half, actually doesn't want to be involved. Actually sees Russia as at least neutral, which is a staggering change. Like if you think like Republicans of the 80s
Yeah.
who were all for the fight with the Soviets. And I've met Americans who are like that in Ukraine and are fighting for Ukraine. And they kind of like, they're the sons of the people who always wanted to fight the Soviets but couldn't. But now they are fighting them, their sons are fighting them in Ukraine. The change that occurred, I mean, but it took years, and I think
Yeah.
we're at it's not the beginning. It's kind of like not to say that this change peaked,
Yeah.
but I think it's been going on for quite some time.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, for students of history who know how Soviet Union was the great evil for a good chunk of the 20th century, now all of a sudden to just completely shift that around so quickly,
It's
yeah,
staggering.
it's just bizarre.
But you see, Amar, I'll use this example. Hungary is not far from where I'm based, and I sometimes go there. Great place and everything. And my Poland has always had special relations with Hungary, regardless of who was in power. And now, you know, Orban came to power in 2010, and that's 15 years now. It's his fourth term. You can imagine that, like, and how much you can work on the imagination and the perceptions of your population, especially if you control most of the media. And I don't just mean TV or newspapers,
Yeah.
you're actually, and yes, it changes people's outlook. Now, something like that did not happen in the US, but the buildup of certain forces that in Europe would be called far right,
Yeah.
first on the fringes of the Republican Party and then moving to the center and then to the core of that very Republican Party, results with the fact that, well, these guys, well, don't see Russia as an issue, not anymore, and seem to be okay with forgetting the fact that the Red Dawn was such a great movie with Patrick Swayze, in the 1990s. It's kind of not the one with the North Koreans, but the original one,
Yeah.
where they were fighting a Soviet invasion. It's staggering, but I mean I've seen it happen right next door. I mean almost right next door in Hungary. So I'm imagining this as a much bigger operation but yeah, I mean, equally successful, so to speak.
Have you seen, I mean, shifting a bit to the foreign fighter phenomenon, I mean, have you seen a similar shift in people joining the Russian side? Has that number gone up as this kind of shift in rhetoric has happened in the US? Because, if we look at the 2014
Yeah.
foreign fighter mobilization, it looked a very particular way. And then it changed in the 2020s. And so what dynamics are you seeing in terms of
Yeah.
Westerners or, people
Good,
around
good
them?
point, Amar. I think Russia still after 2022 kind of didn't mind people
Yeah.
being recruited for its war effort. on a voluntary basis, not like the North Koreans or like, the people who are promised a job from, I don't know, Nepal or Sri Lanka, and then
Mm.
they're supposedly working a construction site in Moscow, but in reality, they're fighting on the front line. So a slightly different, especially the Serbs were to the fore in that effort. The links from 2014 and even in the 1990s. The guy who started shooting in Ukraine, Igor Girkin, he fought in the 90s for the Serbs, or the Bosnian Serbs, if you like. The Russian, GRU colonel or whatever, now the jailed presidential candidate who wanted to be a presidential candidate in Russia, but usually, if you're not called Vladimir Putin, then your health is in serious jeopardy. That's what happens. That's what happens to you. But essentially, the Serbs were at the forefront of this attempt to actually recruit people, and there were units like that fighting around Kherson, by the Dnieper River. But to be honest with you, Amar, a lot of it was actually low key and didn't yield many returns. But in the last couple of weeks, yes, in the spaces that I watch and observe, you can see the Russians allowing for more people like that to come to the fore. So here's a Frenchman, here's an Irishman, here's an American, but these are individual cases of someone who usually of their own violation and really struggled, through Istanbul or Belgrade, went to Russia and somehow convinced the Russians, because that's also another, that's a tall order. Getting
Mm.
there is one thing, but then convincing them that you're the real deal or that you're not some CIA plot or
Yeah.
something like that, that's another issue. So, credit to these guys actually, because they might have talked a great talk, to be honest with you, or had some great references. But it's not a huge phenomenon. And I think it's mostly the ones that I'm also the ones from the US who are fighting on the Ukrainian side, even if they're Republican, they would still, their heart would be on the right side of history, if I could put it this way. Plus, I wouldn't expect all these, cheerleaders for Trump wanting to leave US because things are so great in the US at the moment. That's
Mm.
always the kind of, as you know very well, that there also has to be a bit of a push factor.
Yeah.
And it seems that the push factor isn't exactly there unless it's personal. So you will have these guys doing these individual things, and probably you're going to get more of Tucker Carlson's, like, going in and
Mm.
discussing 10th century Russian history with Vladimir Putin, kind of that kind of stuff. This is another bizarre incident. So I think not so much. I think the business is tricky. There will not be people going to join the Ukrainians, that many, but I don't see some kind of a floodgates opening. I
So,
do
so the
see.
numbers have gone down, you think,
I think,
from.
yeah, I think, numbers wise, it's really. I think it's, the funny thing for the report that we wrote, and it's kind of a bit of a sad conclusion that both sides now rely on their own mercenaries, if you like. I mean, with Ukraine, it's not really that it's harsh. They're basically a huge chunk of their people that they feel are basically coming from Latin America or from other exotic places from the point of view of Ukraine. Sorry for putting it this way. And essentially, they really do come in to earn their bucks,
Mm.
and they really don't want to die. And the culture of the Ukrainian army, which is very much do it yourself and kind of bottom up as well, every unit has a kind of a fund where soldiers chip in. So if you want to have a better XYZ than the kit that you get, you actually buy it on the market. That's very Ukrainian, Amar. That's the quintessentially Ukrainian thing to do. And as a Pole, I go, right, of course they would. But now, if you are a Colombian who came in to earn your money there, you don't want to chip in. You're thinking like, what the heck is this? Like, this is probably their sky, they want my money
Yeah.
or they're not paying me. Then obviously add to that a bit of a cultural difference, and I'm putting it really mildly, and add to that the linguistic barrier, which
Mm.
sometimes is there, sometimes isn't, depends on your luck, and you've got a recipe for a bit of an uneasy type of a situation. So that's one thing. That the ones who were coming in the basically last year, who made an impression in this sense, were basically guys who were after the money. This whole democracy argument, let's defend the West. I mean, come on, if you're Colombian or Brazilian, well, tricky, to be honest with you.
Mm.
Although some of them seem to be having a slightly better time because they're organizing in these kind of mono-ethnic subunits. and they're really trying, pushing hard to establish themselves there. So that's the one side. Plus, you had the old timers. So the guys who came in 22, 23, some of them came back, and they are from all over the world, but they're mostly Western. Quite a few Americans, a bunch of Brits, and here's a German, here's a French, here's an Italian, a Pole, that, total mix, like the whole International Legion was supposed to be. But funnily enough, Amar, they're not fighting for the International Legion that much. They are spread all over the place. And I think this is, again, another quintessentially Ukrainian thing. The flexibility is the name of the game. So if you can get yourself in front of the brigade commander, and the Ukrainian army is organized in brigades, and convince him that I'm a good guy and I can do XYZ for you, he'll take you. And you don't have to be in the International Legion. You'll be in a genuinely Ukrainian unit, probably doing better work or feeling more appreciated and kind of, more down to earth and more in action than quite a few of these who are in purely, international units. But, I know guys who are in both, and, it's become, as you would expect, it's like a drug, really.
Yeah.
People say, one of my interviewees said, the Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
You love Ukraine and you hate it because it oppresses you in a way, right? Because this is this place that you lost your health, your savings, your relationships and stuff, yet you still want to fight for it. That's what, the title of the report is People Are Still Fighting, because this is the kind of, let's say, the group of people that I'm focusing on. On the Russian side, yeah, that's purely mercenary, right? You vacuum clean people from all over with offers of doing construction sites in Russia, or some promises of great money and a passport, or maybe a chance to then run to Europe. That's the funny one. Or you get people such as the North Korean troops who have basically been ordered to volunteer, or whatever, whatever you want to put it. So it's very different from the 2014, when it was mostly, inverted commas, the crazies went. And it's very different from 2022, when it was the, I don't know, Democrats, but I don't mean Democrats politically, but I mean people caring about fighting for, smaller, let's defend, the weaker side against the stronger side. It's a nice story. Now it's been, it's all gray and pretty bleak, to be honest with you.
So last question. I mean, I should say we're recording this on April 28th because things shift almost hourly. But the news from this morning was the famous sit down with Trump and Zelensky I think it was St. Peter's Basilica, followed by this idea that Trump says that Crimea could be given over as a part of a peace plan. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that as you read some of those headlines.
Yeah, I think, Amar, just go to Ukrainian constitution and read Article 2, which basically says that Ukraine's territory is one. So of course, events can shrink Ukrainian territory. I get that. It's already happened. But do not expect any Ukrainian leader, and I mean any, to actually sign a peace deal, permanent peace deal, that says, this is it, right? We give you this, we give you that, and you leave us. It's not happening. It's just not happening. And I think Zelensky knows this. Zelensky is also conscious of the fact that he was elected on the platform of maybe let's find a solution, right, to this. And he tried, and whenever he tried, there were these massive protests in Kiev, probably also orchestrated by, the opposition, and there's always the dark arts there, but I mean, plenty of veterans were always marching on Bankova Street, which is the administration of Zelensky. So I just don't thought, I see it as an element of a US strategy to push Ukrainians into concessions. Oh, he said this, bang, we've got it ticked. Oh, he agreed, and now Zelensky has to explain himself. Then Russia comes out with its demands, right? And the demands, they're still talking denazification. They're talking things as, okay, we're going to sign a truce, but you need to promise us that during this truce, Ukraine will not rearm. I love it. You're doing a truce and you're fighting a war and you're expecting the other side not to rearm. So I have a request for Russia: do not let in any North Koreans, Iranians, Chinese, or anything. And yeah, fine, we can sign. such a truce. So I think we're in this phase of the US expressing its anger, disillusionment, but never pushing Russia, always pushing Ukraine. You don't see, Trump says, "Oh, I'll have some sanctions for you, Putin." He doesn't call him Mr. Putin or Mr. President, he's using Putin, which is also interesting. But I mean, have you seen these sanctions? Everyone got a tariff, and I'm speaking to a Canadian, so I'm
Yeah.
pretty conscious of what's happening here. And Russia got nothing. No tariffs on Russia. Of course, the trade, between United States and Russia isn't exactly booming. I get that. But that shows you that for me, this is an element of, let's push Ukrainians. Let's frame the discourse in such a way that Ukraine will be on the defensive. And that's how I see it. And I think the only worry. The reality is that if you think that Moscow is going to actually interpret it this way, that okay, he's doing it for us and we will stop asking for more, you don't know Moscow.
Is,
Honestly.
is the view, I said last question, but I lied. So this is the last question. But is the view amongst Ukrainians, you think, in the face of what's happening with Trump, um, to say, would they still protest on the streets of Kiev if Zelensky talks about some sort of concessions, or is this understanding that without the U.S., like they're in a much weaker position potentially, and therefore we should be more willing to give concessions? Like, which side are they falling on with Trump too, speaking and saying and
Yeah.
doing things that they're doing?
I think, Amar, this is the billion-dollar question because obviously, let's just say politics is in a bit of a suspension
Yeah.
in Ukraine, but they wouldn't take it, I would say. I cannot tell you if the protest would be 100,000 people or 5 million or whatever,
Mm,
but I think as much as they would see it as a further invitation to Russia to go for more in the
mm,
future. So of course, we could say, the pragmatic thing would be to let Donbas go because it's already ruined. And all the people who wanted to live in Ukrainian Donbas have already left the Russian Donbas and are now in Ukraine proper, if you like. But I think the stigma of giving in and then the fear that this invites further, let's be honest, Amar, you can sign any truce, peace, or whatever. Both sides will be thinking that this is going to resume in 2, 5, 10 years' time. So, which of course some tried to sell to Ukraine to say, well, actually sign, and then in more favorable circumstances, you might reclaim it. But I don't think they're thinking along these lines. And I think the fate of Donbass, especially here in this sense, and well, Crimea as well. Okay, and this is how Trump is framing it. You haven't defended it, and it's been out of your hands for a decade.
yeah.
Why touch it? That's probably what they would be fearful of. And I think that, the tragedy of it is as much as and that's why I understand Europe actually being intent on keeping the US in this very game, because they realize quite clearly that, without the US muscle, intelligence, arms, satellites, and whatever muscle that they've got, well, Ukraine is severely weakened because, all it took was the US to actually start signaling that it's moving away from this. And Amar, you haven't seen, and we haven't seen the kind of like any country saying, okay, we can match this, even though France might have been saying, for the sake of its glory, and where Turkey's been saying from time to time, we can do a bit of a service for you here, but it's never as strong and as thorough as the one by the US. But coming back to Ukraine, I don't think they would take it lying down. They have a history of resistance against Russia, and they would come back to it, I would say. Certainly. I can't, I'd love to see the economic argument
Yeah.
that, let's just focus on ourselves and let's just forget about it, because I don't think they will forget about it, to be honest with you. I don't think they would still be conscious of the fact that the Russians are coming back. And, President Putin quite openly says that, we need to rearm for another conflict, which I wonder who's it going to be against. So that's kind of, again, puts that in this perspective. But anyways, yeah, that's my convoluted answer. What I feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Putin has proven himself to be a trustworthy kind of negotiator in these realms either. So, On that note, thanks very much, Kacper. Enlightening
you.
as always, and we'll keep our eyes on the news and see where it goes. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you.